Okay, so just some feedback. I may not have, so on Canvas, this was a new one too, because most of your quizzes, I am recording now, so this is, if you guys have questions, other people will be able to hear the answers if they missed the Zoom today. I will take some, I will take roll. The Zoom sessions are required, but if you've made prior arrangements or talked to me ahead of time, maybe you've got something that you can't miss and you can't be at home to do the Zoom. I get that. Stuff happens sometimes. So some questions here. Kaya was asking about the computer specs assignment and said she didn't see it on Canvas, and then Josh says it was there. So can somebody help people out too? It should be a text input box in the assignment section. You should be able to copy and paste text into a window. Did that work for people? I see a couple people nodding. Any thumbs up from the gallery?
Yeah, I just saw it. I just looked.
Okay, because I might have made a mistake too, and I am not an expert on Canvas yet. I don't know if I'll ever be an expert. And because in my class, when I taught in the classroom that actually had people in it, as opposed to this big empty room here, you know, I didn't use Canvas that much. I used Canvas for attendance and stuff like that. So if I mess up and didn't post it right, don't feel bad about asking a question. Say, hey Dave, I couldn't find that, or I think you messed up on Canvas or whatever, and that is definitely a possibility. So in that, go ahead.
I was gonna say, you have screen sharing disabled. I was gonna go ahead and share my screen to show,
I will fix that here. Oh, shoot. Okay, so that's under the security tab.
Yes,
all right.
110.
Pardon me?
Did you only post it for the CTS 110 class?
For the computer specs assignment, I thought I cross-posted it in both. And that's going to be something we need to figure out today too, is that I thought everybody that was in the 115 class was in the 110 class. So how many, is there anybody else that's in this class that's only in the 115?
I'm only in 115.
Okay, so who's that? Is that Viv?
Kaya.
I'm only in 115 too. It's Jorge.
Okay, so I will cross-post that as well. And that's going to be an issue because I thought, because people that are in the 2-year degree program have to take the 110 and the 115. But there's a few students that are in the machining program that are only in the 110. And I thought that everybody, again, you know what they say about assuming stuff. I thought that everybody that was in the 115 was in the 110, but there's a couple of you that are only in the 115 class. Is that correct? Okay, so I'll cross-post that assignment to both of them because you don't have the visibility for both of them. So just save it. If you've typed it up and you've got it in like Notepad or Google Docs or however you've got it, we're going to be talking about that today. And then after class, you could submit it to the 115 assignments area. Is that okay? So the two classes do have a lot of back and forth, and so we'll have assignments. And if you're only in the 115 section, I'll make sure that those assignments are posted in the 115. And there will be some assignments that are unique to just one class, right? So for the quizzes, for instance, you're going to have a quiz in one class or the other, right? We won't have one quiz for both classes, if that's clear. So that's good for me to know that there are a few students, not very many, a couple, 2 or 3, that are only in the 115 class for whatever reason. Okay, good. That's a good question though. Excellent. Okay, I feel like we're making some progress here. All right. Okay, so today we were talking about hardware and your specs for your home computers and stuff like that. I posted some stuff to we had your assignment, which I'll fix to allow people to input text for both classes. And it was supposed to just be kind of for fun to try to figure out what your specs were for and as I mentioned in the discussion area too, over the weekend, some of my computers I have at home are running pretty minimal specifications, but because they're not being used as gaming.
Wait, how many computers do you have at home?
Probably more than I should because I'm a hoarder. My wife accuses me of hoarding stuff. And I'll pick, so like I have one sitting on my desk in the classroom here so some of the stuff that I get at auctions or things like that, I would bring into the classroom, because if I kept bringing boxes like stereo equipment or computers home, my wife is like, I don't want to see any more. She just refers to them as black boxes. So if it's a stereo or a computer or whatever, the generic term is that there's a black box coming into the house. So yeah, I used to just bring them in the classroom. So, and most of them are pretty cheap. I don't really, the only one I've got that's kind of a good computer is the one that's hooked up to the TV. So I have like a home theater computer, and it would do light gaming and stuff like that. So it's got a halfway decent video card, but I've got, several old laptops and things like that. And that's what I was mentioning, if I've got, an old laptop that I picked up at an auction, it's only got 4 gigs of RAM. I bought it because have you ever seen those kind of armor plated laptops like the Army has that have like rubber and metal and stuff like that? So this was one that used to be mounted in a cop car. The Wenatchee Police Department was selling a bunch of stuff a couple years back. And so I bid on one of these laptops, and it's pretty cool. I mean, it needed a new battery because the battery was pretty toasted. But you're supposed to be able to drop it from like 10 feet or, whatever. It's got these big rubber armor things around it. But the specs are pretty wimpy. It does have a real small solid state drive, but it's only running 4 gigs of RAM. But hope there's Devin in there. But anyway, I digress, talking about computer hardware, but because it only has 4 gigs of RAM, I'm running Linux on it, and it works pretty well, as a day-to-day lap, you can just do whatever, you surf the internet on it, do lots of stuff, but you wouldn't be gaming on it particularly. So, all right. So yeah, if we'll take a look at some of your computer specs and stuff like that, and you guys should have the ability to share your screen at this point, and you can use the chat window. Looks like everybody's here today, which is great. So we've got good attendance, off to a good start this quarter. And I hope to keep this up where you're not feeling like you're getting too burned out on the Zoom stuff, because we're doing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday again. These 2 classes, the hardware and software, we're kind of combining. You guys that are in both classes, what you'll notice is that the books, the person that wrote the books actually kind of plagiarize themselves. Some chapters even have a lot of repetition between the 2 books. So it feels like it's an okay thing to, oh, I get distracted sometimes, like, because I'm trying to read the chat window too, in case people have questions over there. So people are like drop kicking. So, all right. Yeah. If you lose your connection, I'll just let you back in the window here. I'll make Devin a co-host so he can admit people if he needs to. All right, see, there's one sitting there in the window. Okay, so we've been talking about operating systems as well as for both classes. So hardware, you guys were able to find your specs for your hardware for your computers.
The easiest assignment of my life.
Right. Yeah. So it wasn't supposed to be hard. So basically, yeah, you're looking, and some of you know your specs offhand. You're like, yeah, I got a Core i7 7700 and 32 gigs of RAM or whatever. There's different ways to find that information. Obviously, there's Speccy, which we talked about on Wednesday, and you can download and install that. I put the link online too. Again, I will be better about cross-posting these assignments to both classes. So if it's an assignment that is kind of a generalized hands-on assignment that I want everybody to do, I'll cross-post it to both, which will kind of be a little confusing. But and then we'll have some assignments that are straight up just hardware and some assignments that are just software. So we might talk about it a little bit in the lecture section, but if you don't see it pop up on your assignments list, so for instance, if we're talking about operating systems today, operating systems are mainly going to be in the 115 class, right? I hope so. I thought he was nodding, but he's just bouncing around in the truck. He's not nodding. He's nodding involuntarily. All right, so at any rate, well, you guys should have had pretty good luck at figuring out your specs for your home computer. And like I said, if you're not a gamer, then that really opens up to using the computer for lighter duty tasks and things like that. How many of you have laptops at home as your only computer? Okay, and that's pretty common. If you are not And they actually do have gaming laptops too. Some students buy some fairly powerful laptops which can do gaming, and you can plug in an external monitor. So if your monitor that's on your laptop is not large enough, you can plug in an external monitor and have that going while you're playing games and stuff like that. So a laptop can do pretty good double duty as a desktop replacement for that. And some of them have a dedicated video card subsystem. So when we're talking about hardware for either class, integrated, what's integrated mean?
It's bad. Throw it out the window.
It's not necessarily bad.
It's
Yeah.
on your motherboard.
Yeah, so it's a dedicated video card means that it has, and it still might kind of be part of the motherboard, but if you have a dedicated video card, what that means is your video card has its own processor, and it's called a GPU, a graphics processing unit, and then you have your central processing unit, which is your the brain of the computer, what we normally think of as the processor. So if you have dedicated video, even in a laptop, it means it has its own graphics processor, and it has its own RAM. It has its own memory for its video subsystem. And if you're running a gaming computer, that means you have a separate video card. And not just gaming computers have dedicated video cards. This is still sitting under the desk. So this little computer here, if you can see it, the only card that it has right here is a little video card. And so it'll have slightly better video performance. You can see here's the card in the slot here. It's got a DVI connector. Actually, technically, no, that's not a DVI connector, but I don't want to get too sidetracked here. So even though this is a business computer, it's not designed to run games at all, it would have slightly better performance than a computer that did not have a video card. And the reason for that is that the video cards, if they are integrated, as people were mentioning, they're part of the motherboard, they will share memory with all the applications that you're running. So when we're talking about operating systems here today and hardware, again, kind of combining the two, the operating system uses memory, right? So when you boot up the computer, we'll talk more about the boot process, like what actually happens when you push the button. And I'll cross-post the videos too. So I put a link to a video. It'll kind of run double duty. So if you see links to stuff under both class headings, that's fine. You only have to watch the video once. You don't have to sit through, obviously, watch it twice. But there was a pretty good one where it showed, you're pushing the button, it sends a signal through the motherboard to the power supply to kick on full blast. That sends power to the system board. It boots up the computer, so the BIOS on the motherboard starts looking for things that have something to be bootable. So typically your hard drive will have your operating system on it, and it starts to load. So the hard drive is spinning, or if it's solid state, so it's starting to load up your operating system, which is software essentially, and then it's loading it into RAM. So the whole time your computer is running. So how many of you we'll go back to gallery view for a second. How many of you had 4 gigs of RAM in a laptop? I have a couple older laptops, 4 gigs. That's okay. It'll run Windows. It's not going to run a whole bunch of stuff at once. If you have 8 gigabytes of RAM, that's a little bit better. That's pretty common. And that's a good baseline. 8 gigs, if you're buying that'll be fine for running, a couple applications at a time. 16 gigs, gamers oftentimes will want 16 gigs of RAM. And if you're only running 1 game at a time, you're probably not going to use all 16 gigs. So if you are at your own computer right now, which obviously you are, if you do the good old 3-finger salute, so Control-Alt-Delete all at the same time, and I don't know what this will do to Zoom. So if I run Control-Alt-Delete and I run Task Manager, so click on Task Manager. So 3 fingers all at the same time, the Control key, the Alt key, and Delete all at the same time. You should see Task Manager as one of your choices. Did you guys all get that? And this is not new to some of you. So if and you should see it on my screen at this point. So I see Task Manager, and then under the Performance tab, if I click on Performance, and this will also give you some information about your computer. So this is good for both classes, whether it's hardware or software. If you're trying to keep track of, so here it's showing me a little bit of specs on my computer. And if I click down under memory, so here's my CPU, and Task Manager view under Performance tab shows you a snapshot. It's the current, what's currently running on the system. You can set up programs to map this over a longer period of time, like if you're trying to figure out, hey, you know, what do I need to replace on my computer? So I can see my CPU. This is my computer here at the school, which is actually way better than my computer at home. We got these, I think, at the beginning of last school year. So they have i7 7700Ks, so pretty good processors. That's a quad core processor, I believe. And at the K at the end means it's unlocked, which means theoretically it could be overclocked if it wasn't stuck inside of a Dell motherboard that doesn't allow that. It's running at 4.2 gigahertz, so 4200 megahertz.
Silly Dell.
Yeah, well, it's kind of understandable. I mean, you know, if Dell's worried about warranty issues and stuff like that, they don't want people overclocking stuff and making stuff get hot and burn up and all that. So if I click down to memory here, you can see that I have 32 gigs of RAM, which is quite a bit. You know, for a home computer, that's a lot. What that allowed us to do on these computers here in the classroom was run stuff virtually as well. So we'd have the host operating system, and then inside of Hyper-V or VirtualBox in a window, you could run another operating system, you know, a server or an instance of Linux or something like that. And with that much RAM, I could run 2 or 3 at the same time. I could have these virtual machines running. Now I'm currently using 10 gigs of RAM, which is quite a bit. And that's because I have a bunch of stuff running in the background. I have all these tabs open in Chrome. I have, I think, 2 or 3 instances of Chrome open, and each one has a whole bunch of tabs. So I'm kind of I need to start shutting some of that stuff down. In the background, I'm also running Zoom in the background. Discord's running in the background. So you can see I've got a bunch of things open. So if I only had 8 gigs, I might be in trouble, but I've got more RAM than that. So what that allows you to do, to go back to my original story, is that when you have things open, each thing that you have open uses some memory. So having more memory on the computer, more RAM, allows you to run more things at the same time. If you're typically only running like 1 game at a time, you could get away with having 8 gigs of RAM, or maybe even 4, depending on what you're doing. But if the more things you want to have open, and that includes the operating system. So the operating system is called what they call resident in memory. So as soon as you start booting up the computer, it loads the operating system into RAM, right? And then anything else that you want to have running is also going to be running in your system memory. And that's why if you have a video card, so let's see what other details they've got here. So, okay, so here you can see under this screen, if I move this over, Chrome is using up a lot of my, a lot of instances. I have way too many tabs open for Chrome. You guys are laughing at me here. So you can see all the memory that's being used up is, a lot of it is by Chrome, because I have multiple copies open, and then each tab uses up a little bit more memory. And Chrome is a known memory hog as well. So you can see that I've got a lot of this stuff here running. And the operating system obviously is taking up some of that as well. So at any rate, and then so under these, if you haven't, Task Manager has gotten better. So if you go down, you can also see my Ethernet statistics, you know, how much bandwidth is being used, and then also your GPUs for your, so I have the built-in GPU, which isn't really doing anything. And then at the bottom, I've got the GPU for the actual video card. And these had GeForce GTX 1060s. With 6 gigabytes of RAM. So they're an okay video card for what isn't supposed to be a gaming system. These were systems for, you know, business use and stuff like that. Were you guys all able to get that open? Task Manager, check out your own systems. Okay, so that gives you a good quick snapshot. It'll help you if your system is running slowly. You can open that up and you can see, you know, what are you maxing out on? Are you maxing out on memory, for instance? And what happens, well, let's shut this off for just a second, because some of you guys know this too. So what happens when your computer, let's say you've got 8 gigabytes of RAM and you're using 8 gigabytes, and then you try to load another program? What does your computer do when it runs out of physical memory, like actual? If I only have two, let's say I have 2 sticks of 4, that's 8 gigabytes of RAM total. What happens when I try to use 10 gigabytes like my computer's doing? Does it crash and burn? Maybe. Where's our hardware nerds in here? What does your computer do when it runs out of physical memory?
Does it try to use like actual hard drive space for RAM as like a quote unquote swap RAM?
Yeah.
What it's called,
Yeah.
swap?
Yeah. So yeah, Devin's got there. So yeah, it's trying to, when it runs out of real, what it quote unquote real RAM or physical memory, it tries to use your hard drive. And there's different names for this, which they'll talk about more probably in the, so your book is divided up, if you're in the hardware class, it's divided up into kind of like sections. You'll have the motherboard section, CPU section, RAM section. In the operating systems book, they'll talk about it as well, because it's a function of the operating system. So Windows will say, okay, I need this much RAM, I'm running these applications. And as Devin mentioned, when it runs out of physical memory, so like if my computer only had 8 gigs of RAM and I'm trying to use 10 gigabytes worth of stuff, it's going to start writing information to the hard drive into a section of the hard drive that's called your swap file or virtual memory. So different operating systems will call it different things, but it's basically the same idea, is that a chunk of your hard drive is dedicated to this swap space where it'll swap in information and read it back out as it needs it. So what happens is your computer just slows way down, right? If people are saying that their computer is running slow, then you might want to open up Task Manager, say, hey, what are you working on right now? Have them show you what they're doing, and then you can open up Task Manager and you can see, if their RAM is maxed out all the time, their computer needs more RAM, needs more memory. And that was one of the things we talked about last week, was when you're talking to people, they might say something like, hey, my computer is out of memory. And what they really mean is that it's out of hard drive space. We've got more, yeah, if there's questions in the chat room too, yell at me too if there's stuff that, but other people are answering questions too in the chat, so that's fine. If other students can answer, that's great. If you're not getting your questions answered, because it's hard for me to keep an eye on both things in the in the chat room too, or the group chat. All right, so at any rate, if your computer is running out of memory and they tell you that, it may not mean that they're running out of RAM, or it could be, it depends. So a lot of times when you're talking to people, you have to ask them some follow-up questions to really try to get an idea of, because their vocabulary for talking about a computer isn't maybe going to be the same as somebody who works in IT. If you're working in this industry, hopefully you're starting to learn the right words for stuff, and sometimes there's more than one word for the same thing. But if you're talking to a home user or somebody so a lot of people, if you're working in IT and you're doing desktop support, you might have to go to somebody's desk or however it happens to be, and they may be running a specific application, but they're not maybe very fluent in how the computer works. Maybe they're really good at their job and really good at running Excel spreadsheets or Photoshop or whatever, but they could care less what's inside the computer, right? To them, it's just a box. They hit the power button, it makes a noise, the screen.
How dare them?
And they're happy campers, right? But when stuff
Computer
doesn't,
lives matter too.
yeah. So when stuff doesn't work right, they're going to express to you however they can in whatever words they have that it's not working. So you kind of have to ask them some follow-up questions, right? Okay. So yeah, this morning we're kind of talking about multiple different things, but so basically it's tying into computer hardware and also tying into the operating system, because the two work together, and you can't have a computer without operating systems. I was Googling it this morning because I was curious when the first operating system was created, because we had computers, but they were the older computers, and we're talking like in the 50s. The older computers were really like glorified calculators, and you would feed them data with a, and specific math problems and things like that. But according to the internet, you guys Google it up here. Google, when was the first operating system, and it's finishing out my sentence for me, system created?
Unix 63.
Okay, I get a different answer.
Dang it.
Yeah,
Well,
so do I.
You
I
guys
got
are
1956.
okay. So this is what Google is saying. Have you guys? Are we all?
I was guessing. Was it Unix though?
You didn't even Google it. You're just guessing. That's fine. Guesses are good. Unix is very old as well. That's a good answer.
So
What?
IBM 704.
There you go. But the operating system was made by who? They're saying in '56. This is just what pops
General
up.
Motors.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, the people that were making cars and stuff. But General Motors also used to have a big research division. They had these computers, and it's what Google is saying is that IBM would make the mainframe, and then these companies would buy the mainframe, which was this huge computer, and it was basically just this machine, but you had to create your own operating system to make it do what you wanted to do. So General Motors might want it to do one thing. Maybe they're calculating, crash statistics or something. Who knows what they're doing with it? And then somebody else would buy the same computer and they would make their own system for it. They would feed it their own software. So what they're saying is that GM produced the operating system for this particular computer. And it says most other early operating systems for IBM mainframes were also made by the customers. So IBM would make the hardware, but they were relying on programmers at each place to create software, essentially, to create the operating system. But then if you move on, it says that IBM would it says the first operating system that shipped with a computer was in the 60s, and that was by IBM. So IBM started making its own operating system. So that's kind of
Is
interesting.
IBM a company, or is it I don't know.
That's a good question. It's not around as much these days anyway, right? How many people, some of you have heard of IBM, right?
Yep.
It was a huge, and it still is a huge company. In fact, they are now making like supercomputers, which we can't buy them at home. They have one called Deep Blue that was this huge supercomputer that challenged a human to play chess and beat them. But IBM stands for International Business Machines, and back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they were humongous, and they made lots of computers that were mainframes. They didn't break into they did break into the personal computer market a little bit, in fact, but then it was kind of so Apple, was kind of the big winner for small PCs, or small computers. But yeah, to answer your question, IBM is still around. They made big computers. They actually made home computers as well. And they also dabbled in the operating system market too. In fact, when I was going to college, let's go ahead.
I have a weather app called Weather Underground, and it has IBM. It has an IBM logo on it.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah. And they're definitely still around, but they're focusing on different stuff. They were actually making a competitor to Microsoft Windows at one point. It was called OS/2, and it was very advanced at the time. It even had voice recognition before other operating systems did. But they were kind of in a battle with Microsoft, and they decided to bail out and not pursue making a home operating system for home users. And they would just focus on servers and stuff like that. So they dropped support for OS/2 Warp when Windows 95 came out, which I think was kind of sad, because it was actually had some really cool stuff that OS/2 was able to do that took Microsoft years and years to kind of to come up with some of the same stuff. So yeah, good questions. And the history stuff I find kind of interesting, in terms of just the history of computers. So and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The book does too. And I posted a PDF file. What I was in the process of doing, so just as a heads up for all of you for both classes, is check out the files section in Canvas. You guys know where I'm talking about? So on the left-hand side, you've got files, discussion, all that stuff. So poke around in the file section, and I posted the PowerPoints in there. And I'll keep putting some more stuff in there that you guys might find useful, hopefully. And there was also some other slides that were talking about operating systems, which we'll get into, and I'll put those up on my screen for you. Yeah. So we started off talking about your assignment, which was actually your specs on your computers. Was anybody not able to find was anybody not able to find your specs? Like you just couldn't figure out what your computer was, or you're looking around in the wrong spot? Anybody have any problem with it? Or were there part of the specs that you saw that you wanted more information about, perhaps? Okay. All right. If you do have questions, yeah, yell out here. Yeah, in class we watch a movie too, and it's pretty good. It's kind of talking about the rise of Apple Computer and also Microsoft. So that's
I was just talking about that movie. It's really
yeah.
good.
Which one? What? Because there's several. Which one was the one you were thinking of?
I don't remember the name of it, but I watched it last year in a programming class. So
Okay.
it was, I don't think I even finished it, but
Okay. Yeah,
I'd
the
have to
one we
search it
watched
up.
in class is called The Pirates of Silicon Valley. So I'm
Yeah,
not.
it was that one.
Oh, he's stealing my movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's related to hardware and software and all that stuff, but it's
Mm-hmm.
actually, yeah, there Devin said, yeah, Pirates of Silicon Valley. I think it's probably out online somewhere too. It's I actually purchased the actual DVD for class, so I didn't have
Did you
to
pirate the Pirates of Silicon Valley?
know that I didn't. I actually bought the actual copy. Now I'm not saying I haven't actually
Wow.
ever, but I'm pretty sure it's, yeah, Dave never pirates, right? Devin says never. But and it is ironic. The Pirates of Silicon Valley is probably pirated out there for you guys if you ever want to watch it. And I think it's legitimately on a couple of the streaming services too. But as someone was mentioning, it was originally made for TV. And it's kind of, so it has a little bit of a documentary feel to it, but it's actually a pretty good movie legitimately. So seeing where it's on here. Probably watch
It's not on
most of it.
Netflix.
I think it's on Amazon too. Yeah, it's on, if anybody is an Amazon member, it's actually legitimately on Amazon Prime. And if you're not, you guys as students, I think can get a half price Amazon membership. Not that I don't own stock, unfortunately, in Amazon either, but yeah, so it's legitimately out there. I can put a link to it, and then there's probably some trailers or bits and pieces of it on YouTube too, I would guess. But I'm not going to tell people to go out and pirate a movie. That wouldn't be good. Let's see. Yeah, it's actually on, I think maybe.
I don't see it on Amazon.
It popped up on Amazon. Here's a link to it, or here's a link to bits and pieces of it. I don't think it's the whole thing that popped up on YouTube here. So I'll try this. Yeah, somebody says it's on Prime. Sorry.
Yeah, I see it on Prime.
Yeah. All right, so there's a link to, it looks like a pretty good chunk of it on YouTube as well. So that's sort of related to class, because as far as our history of using computers, you know, when you start going back a little bit further to like IBM, or somebody mentioned Unix or the ENIAC machine, these huge old computers, it wasn't until personal computers started that really people started to use them more at home and at work. Before then, you'd have a mainframe. So like when I was going to college, if you wanted to get on the internet, you would use a terminal somewhere and you'd connect into a mainframe computer that was plugged into the internet, basically. And some of the early systems didn't have any GUI at all. So we're used to having a graphics environment. When we start talking about operating systems, and your book is talking about operating systems, what you'll have is they'll start talking about probably like disk operating systems or DOS. I'm going to grab an old computer. I'll be right back because it's kind of a good history thing here. Get my workout today. All right, can you guys all see this?
Yeah, that's an oldie.
That is an oldie. Now this is a personal computer, but it doesn't run anything that Microsoft ever had anything to do with. This dates from about, I think, 1984. I have a pile of old computers, and this one was here when I got here, and I salvaged it. And we can't run it because I don't have the operating system for it. Now it takes floppy disks, and this is the older style floppy disk that is actually, so you can see the difference here. This one is still old, but this is a 3.5-inch floppy disk, and this one is 5.25 inches, and it's actually legitimately, you know, floppy. And so what this thing would do, there's no hard drive in this computer. You would run the operating system off of one disk, and then you'd run the applications off the second floppy disk. So you'd fire it up and run the operating system. The operating system was basically just to launch applications. And then you'd run the application you're running off the other floppy disk. Storage was entirely on floppy disks. So you would save stuff back to these things, and they were horrible. So at any rate, that's one of the old computers. If you're talking about operating systems, the original operating systems, the old ones, were strictly just to run an application. And so Microsoft in the movie makes its fortune with running Microsoft DOS, disk operating system. No GUI, just a straight up command line interface. So it's kind of interesting in terms of the history, how fast things change. How many of you have heard of Moore's Law? Anybody heard of Moore's Law? Somebody's asking, can you play Pong on it? So that computer that I held up is called a K-Pro, and it was mainly for word processing. So people that were writers back in the day, if you were like Stephen King back in the day, probably owned one of those things, and he would write, and they would do specific applications. But the screen that was on it, that little screen that I showed you, was basically text only. So if you were using that computer, it would only be words on a screen. There really weren't any graphics to speak of. So we've come a long way in a fairly short period of time. So in terms of our progress with computers, that's one thing that's really really makes a big deal, is that computers have changed so quickly. I got dust all over me from. All right, so let me show you another thing on the screen here real quick. If there's anything going. You can play Pong on, yeah, so that would be the next generation. I've got an old Apple computer up there too. It actually is, it's too bad you guys aren't, because there's some fun, cool old stuff kicking around the classroom that you guys could check out. And I'll try to show you stuff on screen, but we'll talk about Moore's Law for just a minute here. We've got a few minutes for class. And this is, here's my, if you guys Google it, you'll come up with, and it's also mentioned in the book, so hopefully you guys can see this on the screen. This is talking about Moore's Law. Now, this isn't really a law like, you know, the law of thermodynamics or gravity or something. This is really more of an observation that somebody had made, that computers, and specifically the number of transistors inside the CPU, keeps roughly doubling every 18 months. So it's a pretty good chart here, this little picture. Make this bigger so you guys should be able to see this. And you know, I think we're talking about, like, so this is basically computers predating what we think of as a computer. So here's their kind of like glorified calculators, not really electronic devices, getting into kind of the electronic age here in around World War II. So if you guys have watched, there's a movie that has been out too about this time period with people that were code breaking and stuff like that. So the original computers were used for a couple of things. One of them was calculating ballistics for, you know, artillery and things like that. And then also code breaking. I'm trying to remember the movie right now. Some of you guys will probably chime in on the chat about the movie that I'm struggling to remember. But the original computers, a lot of them were used for trying to either break codes or create codes. But you can see as the timeline goes up, this keeps going up and up and up. And over on the left-hand side, this is calculations per second. And there's also other charts that will show the number of transistors going up and up and up. And so what you have is that, you know, here's the kind of rise of personal computers, and the power that the computers have continues to increase at this doubling about every year and a half to 2 years, something like that. Here's another good picture of it.
Why are mouse brains so insane?
Well, any kind of brain is pretty insane, right? So so our human brain, or even a mouse brain, any mammal, has a pretty complex number of what you would think of as circuits inside of it. So this is a better chart. This is more what I was looking for. So you guys should be able to see this here. And so here's transistor count. And in the book, more so on the hardware side, but they'll talk about transistors as being these little circuits that are inside of the CPU. And it's gotten to the point now that the number of circuits, they're so close together. So when you're talking about CPUs, they'll talk about having like a 12 nanometer platform. That's the distance between the circuitry, and a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. So that's like really, really small. So in fact, if we're watching movies or something about how CPUs are made, it gets to the point where they can't really show you, they could have a scanning electron microscope, maybe show you bits and pieces. So then it kind of turns over to graphics and like a cartoon world, basically showing you how CPUs are made, because there really isn't any way to visualize it because the parameters are so small. So, all right, so at any rate, so you've got, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and this is all, I'm showing my age here, but this is all within my lifetime. So within my lifetime, we've gone down from basically personal computers being almost non-existent. So here's the Intel 8080. When I first started college, we had computers that were what they call XT class, so that they weren't even a 286. So we're talking right around in here, if you can see where my mouse is. And then I didn't own a computer until graduate school, and it was I think it was a 286 computer. And then moving on, and you can see just this increasing number of transistors doubling, and here we are up here. Now what's happened is that the CPUs have gotten to the point where they're having problems putting more and more transistors on a single core. So then they start building computer CPUs that have 4 cores or 8 cores. So essentially multiple processors in one housing, if that makes sense. So it's pretty amazing how fast the computer technology is changing. And, for us as people that are expected to kind of keep up with this, don't get freaked out, because what's really happening is that the technology is getting faster, but the fundamental things that the computers are doing is the same. They're calculating stuff, they're running bits, zeros and ones through complex calculations. But it is pretty cool how fast things are changing, and things, okay, so we've got one's called The Imitation Game. There's one about code talkers as well. The one I was thinking of, I think, is the is that the name? Something close to that, Imitation Game. Anyway, we're off topic on the chat window. All right, so that's Moore's law in a nutshell, is this diagram that I showed you, and it mainly applies to CPUs. So in the book, it's talking about processors and the number of transistors, and this is more related to the hardware book. So a couple of you that are just in the software class, it is mentioned there as well. And this is what is allowing computers to run faster or bigger and bigger operating systems. So the early operating systems that I mentioned, that you could run on a single floppy disk, this held something like not even 1 megabyte of data, like 1 megabyte. This one is 1.44 megabytes, not gigabytes. And the early operating systems, you could run on very, very small hard drives too. So even like early versions of Windows, you could run on, really fairly small hard drives, and they didn't require a lot of RAM. And so these two things kind of go hand in hand. The hardware gets faster and faster, and then software is allowed to have something that'll run it. And so you guys that are gamers, if you look at a game from a long time ago, if you haven't ever played it, you probably have heard of Doom, one of the original Doom games. How many people have heard of Doom? Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
So that was one of the first person shooter games that was pretty popular. It wasn't the first, but it was pretty popular back in the day. And then as the games got better and better, then you had to have a computer that would run it. And sometimes the games outpace the computer development, and people will buy a game and they're like, oh, that game's, like Crisis, that game has a reputation, or did, of being very video intensive. And then, maybe the next year, better video cards come out and people are able to run that game at better speeds, or a really good game comes out and then people feel like they need to upgrade their hardware. So game development in particular, for you guys that are gamers, game development has been one of the driving forces for personal computers improving, because you really don't need to go buy a new computer to run Microsoft Office. You just don't. You guys were talking about new video cards. That Devin, what's the new one that just came out that you guys were so excited about?
I think it was the 3080 that he was talking about, or
Yeah.
And the
3070.
3090 they just dropped like yesterday or something too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. So and is that, that development is similar to CPU development, because graphics processing units, there were the GPUs, they're real similar to a CPU, but they're just focused on just graphics and number crunching and pixel shading and stuff like that. So here's for you guys that haven't seen it, here's a screenshot of one of the original games that really drove personal computer development back in the early 90s. So this is a Doom. Now the joke is that people are getting Doom to run on, because it's such a basic, these days it's a fairly simple program. So they're running Doom on Raspberry Pis or all sorts of devices. Even somebody had it programmed to run on a printer, like the CPU that was built into a printer, and the printer had this little LCD screen on it, and they were able to run Doom on a printer of all things. But back in the day, this was the game. And then the games quickly got better and better. And then that drove, I worked for a company that built computers during school. And, we'd be assembling, for the most part, a lot of like gaming computers for people. But back then the specs, these, 16 megabytes of RAM in 1995 was a lot of RAM. Now 16 gigabytes, you can see how that Moore's law, right there within the last, 30 years or whatever, has gotten to be, exponentially larger. So Doom still brings back fond memories. Now, by the way, this first person shooter, for anybody that hasn't played it, is just side to side. You can't even look up and down. It's basically running through, shooting anything that moves as fast as you can, but it's all just side to side. You're going through these little hallways and stuff like that, and the sounds were pretty basic, but yeah, pretty funny. So yeah, I do play games every once in a while still, but it's definitely not something I have a lot of time for, and I can't just sit still and play for that long. So, all right, Farmville. Okay, so yeah. So as the video cards keep increasing, one of the things that was driving prices up was people using video cards for Bitcoin mining and things like that, or other types of virtual coinage. Okay, so for you guys, be watching on your, for both classes, there will be a distinct set of quizzes for the 115 class and a distinct set of quizzes for the 110 class. So that was a question that was asked earlier. I will get those posted. I'm gonna try to alternate them a little bit. We'll stagger start them a little bit so that if you're in both classes, you can focus on one or the other. You won't have to kind of be doing both at the same time. I hope that helps a little bit. Do you guys have any other questions about, because we're running out of time today for this class. Do you have questions about the quiz format or homework or anything like that?
Are we gonna have a quiz every week?
If you're in both classes, it'll kind of end up being that way, to try to stagger them. They are take-home quizzes. So as you're reading through the book, what I would recommend is, open up Canvas, skim through the questions. So you've read the questions. And then as you're reading the book, you can kind of, they'll pop up, because they're straight out of the book, like verbatim. So as you're reading the book, you'll say, oh, I remember something about that. And you can go back to Canvas and check it out. So the quiz will be open book, open internet. You can try Googling them if you want. Please do read the book. I know there's a tendency for people to be like, okay, there's 20 questions on here, or there's a bunch of true false questions, and they just look up the question out of the book, and that gives them some information. But the book makes a lot more sense if you just read it and some of the questions do come out of the little charts and graphs and things like that too. So, so yeah, you won't all read the book. I don't have any fantasy about everybody's just reading this page after page, but try to as much as you can. Any other questions today? Okay. All right. So we'll talk more, and I'll try to find some other. Yeah, she's saying it's a hard read, but lots of good info. Yeah, I mean the books are okay. You know, you're going to get information from them. We'll try to supplement that, and I'll post links to the discussion board as well on Canvas. So if I find other materials or maybe a movie that might be kind of fun, you know, even in class we would watch those every once in a while for a break. And unfortunately, we can't all get together. I know some people have talked about doing like Netflix things where you can all watch the same thing and chat with them at the same time. But I don't know that all of you have Netflix, and it wouldn't be fair if, you know, a third of you didn't have Netflix to say, okay, tonight we're going to have homework where you have to watch Netflix. But if it's on YouTube or on the net and available out there, then everybody has access to it. So I'll try to post resources that everybody has access to instead of just it being a paid subscription thing, if that helps too. So. Okay, so we're going to meet back here tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Again, if there's something that I want both classes to do, I'll cross-post it under your assignments. Otherwise, each class will have separate assignments. Every once in a while, there'll be something that we'll work on as a whole group, and I'll just cross-post it. And that means you'll have to submit it twice if you're in both classes to get credit for it in Canvas. Copy and paste it into both classes. Does that make sense? So if it's some small little assignment, and we're keeping track of stuff that way, so everybody gets their points and all that good stuff. Okay, so I see people yawning. You need more caffeine. All right, and also if you have a camera, it's really nice. I know not everybody can do that, but it's nice for me to feel like I'm talking to actual people. And if you don't have a camera, put a picture on there, so at least I can put a face to the name. And that'll help other students as well. So when we're working on stuff. And sometimes we might break up into smaller groups, but we're going to go ahead and end it for today, and we'll meet back tomorrow and keep an eye on Canvas for other assignments and other additional bits of information. So, all right, you guys have a good rest of your day.